Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest this time is someone who I've known for a couple of decades, Ondřej Pilný. Ondřej is a professor of English and American Literatures at Prague's Charles University, where he's also director of the Centre for Irish Studies. As he explains, he came to all things Irish after studying the Irish language in the early 1990s led him to Dublin. The academic also discusses literary links between Czechia and Ireland and says low pay prevents him and his colleagues from doing valuable work in their field. And that's all in this edition of Prague Talk with Ondřej Pilný. Ondřej, you're the director of the Centre for Irish Studies at Charles University. When and why was that set up?
It's a long story. We started the first courses, or rather the first courses started at the English department at Charles sometime in the early 90s. The first one was actually an Irish language course taught by a man from the Aran Islands who arrived in 1989. And then there were a few literature courses, and that eventually evolved into a program that was established in 1994, and the centre itself was inaugurated officially in 2002.
Under communism, or even earlier, was there much interest in Irish literature in Czechoslovakia? I mean, I don't expect that the communists were strongly anti-Irish, for example.
They surely weren't, but of course Irish literature suffered the same fate as all other so-called Western literatures in that it wasn't particularly encouraged. And what didn't help also was that there are very few people who actually knew much about Irish literature. Essentially, there was Alois Skomal, who's the translator of Joyce's Ulysses, and who then died in the 1980s, and there was essentially nobody. So not much was being published by way of, for instance, contemporary literature, because nobody really knew anything about it.
And was there earlier interaction between the two countries' literatures? For example, somebody told me that the Czechs were among the first translators of Ulysses. Also, I read that there was some performances of Čapek brothers' plays at the Gate Theatre in Dublin at that time.
There are sort of moments of sporadic contact, really, and the interest in Joyce was really more to do with contemporary experimental literature rather than something like Ulysses being specifically Irish. There was some interest in the work of W.B. Yeats as well under the First Republic, particularly, from the people with sort of Catholic, sort of mystical and esoteric leanings. They would have translated some of Yeats's early work, which sort of went in that sort of direction. And the productions of Čapek's plays, well, Karel Čapek in particular, of course, was, a global star in terms of literature and also was quite famous as a public intellectual. So it's not that surprising that producers in Ireland would reach for his plays. But what was quite interesting was that there was an Irish language production of Bílá nemoc during the Second World War when Ireland was neutral, and you were not supposed to be, producing anything that took a stance in one or other direction during the Second World War, but this was a production that was mounted by Walter Macken in Tawiark in Galway.
This is maybe a slight digression, but when was Finnegan's Wake translated into Czech? I presume it is in Czech.
Finnegan's Wake was never translated. There was a section of it that was translated when Joyce still hadn't finished the book. Anna Livia Plurabella by a group of intellectuals who sort of, Adolf Hofmeister went to Paris to solicit Joyce's permission to do this. But they just did only that one section, Anna Livia. And then in sometime in the 1990s, Tomáš Hrách was trying to, or started translating Finnegan's Wake, but sadly he died before he could get anywhere further with the project, so there are only tiny extracts of it translated.
How many students do you have at the Centre for Irish Literature? Because as far as I know, the Czech system of education is kind of predicated on the idea that you produce as many graduates as may be deemed necessary in a particular area.
Well, not anymore, because, there have been attempts to curb the number of students in the humanities in particular. But to your question specifically about Irish studies, I think there's a fairly strong interest. But the answer in terms of numbers is not that simple, because we are part of a larger department of Anglophone literatures and cultures, and essentially most students who study English under this program will take some courses in Irish literature as optional. And then there's a special master's degree in Irish studies, which is one of the, I think, 4 that we currently offer as sort of specialisms. And in that we would have anywhere between 5 to 15 students, possibly every year, which I think is a fair result, given that in the master's program altogether in those 4 specialisms, we'd have about 40 to 50 students.
Are there any particular writers that students are interested in?
Oh, there's lots. I mean, there's interest, of course, in canonical writers by Samuel Beckett. I teach a course on Beckett, which is always packed. But there's considerable interest in contemporary literature and particularly in women's writing, because I mean, traditionally in the humanities, most students tend to be women, so it's not that surprising that they would reach for the work of the likes of Anna Burns or Sarah Baum or indeed Sally Rooney.
Are there many Irish academics teaching at Charles University?
Depends what you mean by Irish, because essentially when the program was set up, there were 4 of us. I was the only Czech person. There was Claire Wallace, who's from Ireland, and Justin Quinn, who is from Ireland, and then Louis Armand, who's a naturalized Irishman, although originally from Australia, but they've been living in this country now for nigh on 30 years. So I don't know to the extent that they count as Irish still.
You are the past or present, I'm not sure, chair of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures. Do other countries of similar size to Czechia also have comparable interest in Irish literature?
It very much depends. It's really, I mean, Irish studies, for instance, was very strong in Hungary for quite a while, even before us. But sadly, most of the experts are now retired, and their positions were not filled with people with an Irish focus. So it's sort of dwindling at this particular moment. Then, if you look around neighboring countries, there are a few people in Austria, but there are not that many at the moment. Irish studies was traditionally very, very strong in a very broad sense, from, say, Celtic studies up to the study of contemporary fiction written in English, was very strong in Germany. But again, most people are retired, were not replaced, and it's only now that it's being resuscitated at several universities like Wuppertal, for instance.
I know from my own experience, and I've benefited from it, that many Czechs have a very positive attitude to Ireland. Where do you think that comes from?
You'd have to go and ask them, really. I mean, there may be a variety of reasons. In the 1990s, there are so many people who are interested in things like Irish dancing in particular, some in Irish music, but that the wave of Irish dancing is gone at the moment, I think, and so is sadly the interest in traditional Irish music, same as, essentially the whole idea of the folk revival and all that. So there are really multiple reasons.
Sometimes it seems to me that at least some Czechs wish that they were Celts.
Oh, well, they might, but these kind of racial arguments are, looking for alternatives, what it is you might be if you don't feel comfortable. I mean, I think we're a mixed breed, same as the Irish are. I mean, there's a bit of the Celt, there's the Slavs, there's the Germans, of course, the Germanic race being very, very strong, and Jewish and Roma. So take your pick. Again, you'd have to go and ask the Celtophiles.
Is the Irish language still taught at Charles University? I know it was in the 90s.
It absolutely is. We have our own local expert now, Radman Marcus. He's an award-winning translator from Irish as well, and he teaches classes on multiple levels of Irish, and they garner significant interest, not just from our students, but from students of other subjects as well, like linguistics, for instance, or phonetics and all that. So we're really proud of that.
And you're a former student of Irish, I believe.
Well, that's how it sort of started, but I took courses twice, once here and once in Ireland, where I was a visiting student, but never reached the level of, fluency is probably overdoing it, but I never went as far as being able to read, for instance, and I had nobody to talk to, so I just dropped out, sadly. But I still do have a plan that I'll do this properly the third time around, and once I've actually reached that level where I'd be able to read books comfortably. I now have people in Prague who actually speak Irish. Radwan meets with the most advanced students every week in a cafe with a conversation group, and so I could join them, and I could actually use the language even in Prague.
And where did your interest in Ireland and Irish literature originally come from?
That was completely by accident, I have to admit. I really, by a series of coincidences, I won a scholarship for a short stay in Ireland in 1991, and I knew really very little about Ireland. My knowledge of it really was of the extent of being able to point to it on a map, and I've read Joyce's Dubliners, and that really was that. And I felt really happy there, and people were very friendly. My only previous time to an English-speaking country was the south of England, and the contrast with Dublin was huge. And then I was, again, by a series of coincidences, I won a scholarship to study at Trinity College Dublin for a year, which had this absolutely enormous open access library, which was just unheard of in the Eastern Bloc at that time. So I just sat in the library and read books, and became really a fan of Irish literature rather than reading whatever contemporary American novels, which is what I was doing mostly as a student of English before.
I heard an interview with you on the radio in which you said that when you were reading American literature, that you were monitored or observed by the secret police going to the American Center near the embassy.
Everybody was really, and that was one of the very few sources where they actually had the books. So when I was at secondary school, I just went there and took books out, and they took pictures of me. And at that age, I wasn't really sort of bothered about the consequences, which is probably silly, but that's the way it works. They must have a whole photo album of me there, not just me, of course.
And did they ever stop you or speak to you?
No. They just took your picture, you took a bow, and then you went.
One thing I'm also curious about is if you have some way of kind of keeping up with Irish stuff. I mean, do you listen to Irish radio or anything like that? Just so you're kind of surrounded by Irish English.
It's difficult because I'm sort of pretty much glued here to the computer screen, doing email and filling in forms and whatnot. But I do try and go back as often as I can for conferences and, spend at least a few days there. And because Irish radio is fabulous. I mean, you can now listen to it anywhere. You can even listen to radio in Irish if you so wish.
Do you translate a lot?
I do, but not as much as I'd like to, again, because I'm just so busy. I mean, we all have to have, or most of us have 2 jobs just, to make ends meet. So it's getting difficult, but anytime I can, I do something.
And do you tend to translate contemporary authors or classic ones or older ones?
Well, that really varies. I mean, there are not that many gaps with the sort of older authors, and where the gaps are, it would probably be difficult to persuade publishers that it's worth doing, that it's sort of commercially viable or anything. But I've translated anything from John Millington Synge, who'd be one of those, right? Which was actually a commission of that play. I was approached by a theatre to do it, which is absolutely perfect. And then, my first big translation was Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman, which is an experimental novel that I did my master's thesis on, and absolutely loved the work, and translated a few bits and pieces by him later too.
And what do you do if you're stuck, or do you have somebody to check your translating? Because there are some things that are so specific. For example, I saw the movie My Left Foot on TV here, and they translated in the subtitles, "Come home for your tea," as chai, a cup of tea. Is there any way, you wouldn't make that mistake, but do you have any way of checking, and what do you do?
The internet is a godsend in this sense, of course, and translating is just so much easier than it would have been in the sort of pre-internet era, and I just don't know how they did it, behind the Iron Curtain, where you really had nobody to ask, someone like Alois Skomel translating Ulysses without, having much of a chance to talk to anybody. That must have been quite something. But yeah, I mean, there will be moments where you're unsure, and that goes for, Irish English as much as for American English or English English. You just need to, find somebody and double check with them whether, you got the sense right.
And what Irish authors speak to you the most, would you say?
Oh, there's lots and lots. Flann O'Brien remains a favourite, and as well as Samuel Beckett, and I translated some Martin McDonagh as well, which of course is a very, very different genre. I did a bit of Enda Walsh, whose work sadly has not really reached audiences yet. Here there are very, very few successful productions of his work. Recently I did an article on Sarah Baum, whose work I admire very much, and that again is a very, very different genre.
Do you also work in theatre? Because I was reading that you've staged translations of Irish plays in some way.
I was involved in a few translations as a dramaturg, but nothing beyond that. I mean, I don't have any kind of professional training in theatre, so I wouldn't dare to, for instance, direct plays or anything of that sort. But being there at rehearsals of some of my translations was an invaluable experience, and the magic of the word from the page coming alive is something that people should experience if they're translators.
Going back to some of those names that you mentioned, it seems to me that Martin McDonagh is extremely popular, or relatively very popular with Czechs. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a global phenomenon rather than a Czech one, and as regards his breakthrough plays, which were those that are set in Ireland, they have so much in common with, say, the work of early Quentin Tarantino, etc., with those kind of movies. And there was a wave when these plays were being written. There was a wave of popularity globally. That kind of grotesque attitude to violence and that dark humor. That was something that went down well, not just with Czech people, but all around.
As seen, of course, in The Banshees of Inisherin. Did you like that movie?
It's a really interesting one, and it was curious to see, because it is very likely based on a play script that he suppressed at some point, saying that it was no good. It was wonderful to see some scenes in that film that were very clearly based on that play. The dialogues were, a spitting image of those stage plays from the 1990s. So yeah, it was fun to watch.
But Irish people don't say, "You don't like me no more." For me, that's a big kind of block to enjoying the movie.
It's deceptive because the way it is a film, and it's sort of shot on spectacular Irish location and all that. It's conducive to the idea that what you're watching is a realistic image of Ireland, which is something that McDonagh's never done with any sort of setting. So I can see how that can be jarring, but at the same time, I think it's quite deliberate.
I don't know if you remember this, but I interviewed you 23 years ago for Radio Prague, and I didn't listen back to the interview, but I read a description of it, and one thing we spoke about was poor pay for Czech academics. Has that improved at all in the last quarter century?
No, it hasn't, no. I mean, our salaries are naturally higher than they were 23 years ago, but that has to do with inflation rather than the change of attitude. No, it's really sad, and now when you're in your 50s, it gets tedious to use an understatement. That your academic rank would be the highest that you can achieve, and you'd still often be in situations where you'd be wondering where the next load of shopping is coming from if you're on the one salary. So that's why we have two jobs, and that's why so much research and translation work and all that just doesn't get done because we just don't have the time.
Do most of your colleagues have a second job?
Oh, they do. Yeah, I have been deliberately speaking in plural. That is the case. Yeah.
What kind of stuff? Like translating, like you, or?
Well, it's that you won't make much money by translating. Certainly not translating literature, but. We mostly teach at other institutions as well, private universities in Prague in particular, and where the pay is better.
Are your cohort bitter about their lot?
It sort of fluctuates between bitterness and anger and acceptance. The reasons are really historical, I think, because of course the universities would have been seriously underfunded under the communists, and specifically the humanities, because if you're an authoritarian ruler or a party running the country, you are not interested in people teaching students to think in a creative way, or critical and creative way. And then now I think there's that bit of an attitude too, although because politically speaking, we live, thank God, in a very, very different country. But I think the overwhelming attitude in the society is that humanities are generally superfluous and useless, and who cares about them? And that I think is really what causes it at the moment.
Well, if it's any solace, some journalists like me also have to do other work to pay the bills. Recently, there were reports that senior managers at Charles University were getting massive bonuses, apparently, at least in part, for the way that they handled the terrible shooting incident at the Faculty of Arts in December 2023. What's your view of that whole issue?
Well, at the moment, our faculty, the Faculty of Arts, which is the largest at Charles University, is waiting for the budget for this year. And following a significant wave of protests against the inequality in the pay by the same employer, meaning, say, a professor in a medical faculty would have a salary that would be sort of about 3 times higher than, say, mine, there was a compromise reached whereby the basic salaries went up by a margin. And at the moment, we are actually waiting for Charles University to deliver on that compromise, meaning to send us the money for those salaries. And if they do, I have very little to say about the bonuses, although you can dispute the exact amounts that were given to the management. They certainly deserve bonuses for handling that tragic incident. But the question is, does the university have really so much money to cover all the salaries plus those bonuses? If it does, then perfect. No problem by me.
Ondřej, what are you working on right now?
Well, at the moment, apart from answering 30 to 40 emails a day and going to lots of meetings, which is the ordeal of a professor, I'm afraid, I'm part of a large EU-funded grant, interdisciplinary one across multiple institutions, that examines the role of conflict in resilience building. And I'm part of a work package that looks at theatre in particular, and generally the arts, and how it handles this topic.
Do you have any big ambitions remaining? Because you're already a professor, you've achieved a lot. I mean, apart from brushing up on your Irish, that is.
Ambitions, that's a nice one. My ambition is to have time to do absolutely nothing, and thereby get some ideas for, say, the next academic book. My last one came out in 2016, but I just haven't had the leisure to actually stop and think about what the next big project might be. So yeah, possibly that happens at some point. I don't know.
Many thanks indeed to Professor Ondřej Pilný, who took time out of his busy schedule to speak to me for this edition of Prague Talk. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed this episode, why not check out some of the earlier conversations in the series? Find them wherever you listen to podcasts, and don't neglect to subscribe. From me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.